Okay, so as Karen said, I work for the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses and USDA. So it's important for me to note that none of the views that are presented today necessarily reflect the positions of USDA or my office and the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses. What I am going to be talking about is the determinants and benefits of distributed energy generation in rural America, taking us beyond energy contracts that Jason just discussed. The data that I'm using for the presentation are all coming from, most of them are coming from NAS, and some of them are from the Census of Agriculture, some of them are from the ARMS survey, and some are from the On-Farm Energy Production Survey that was an add-on to the 2007 Census of Agriculture that came about in 2009. The publications used focus on distributed generation, solar and wind, and they heavily rely on three publications that I participated in that analyzed the on-farm energy production survey. One of the publications analyzed it at the farm level, another of these publications analyzed it at the state level, and then a third one analyzed it specifically for California, where we looked not only at adoption but also at the size that was chosen. So the reason we're talking about distributed generation, which is generation that is close by to the place where energy is actually going to be used, is because that even though the majority of the wealth opportunities does come through wind leases, unfortunately, these wind leases are only available for very few farmers. They're going to be the farmers that are going to be in the Great Plains and are going to be targeted by wind developers for their land and the wind development there. If you look at this graph, it is set to scale. So how do I use this? Oh, good. So right here, 100 farms for distributed generation are showcased in the same size with 1,000 farms, I meant, for farms that have wind right leases. And as you can see, not only do we have distributed generation on farm in more farms, but we also have it in a more, it is a lot more widely distributed throughout the United States. So compared to about 10,000 farmers that have wind right leases, we see that we have about 60,000 farmers that have distributed generation on their farms. So nonetheless, even though we have a huge development in the last 20 years in renewable energy is not new for rural America. Some of the early adopters of renewable energy actually were on farms, and prior to the 1930s, wind energy was widely used on the farmstead. After the 1930s and rural electrification, we did have a reduction in wind used in agriculture. However, around the 1970s, we start seeing more wind used again in agriculture, as some of the farmers were interested in self-reliance. PV solar entered the pictures in the 1980s, but still we do have some of the first terrestrial PV applications being in rural areas and agriculture. In the 1990s, we have a big change that is occurring, and that is that we're moving from a market for off-grid systems to a market for on-grid systems. So specifically, if you see in that 1995, 68% of the systems were off-grid, whereas in 2008, 68% of the systems were on-grid. This change that has occurred in the last years with the growth being led by on-grid installations is due to the interconnection and net metering policies that have allowed owners to sell excess electricity back on the grid, and have also allowed them to install larger systems. And in addition to that, we have a lot of federal and state policies, especially after 2005, that have really supported renewable energy and have made it a lot more financially, a more wise financial decision to install renewable energy. So we do see that there has been a huge impact, and from 2007, where we had about 10,000 farms that had renewable energy as a distributed generation form, within 5 years we have a five-fold increase to almost 60,000 farms with renewable energy on the farm. And then one thing that's quite interesting is that most of the installations of panels and turbines are actually occurring after 2000, about 80%, and about half of them, and even more for solar, is occurring after 2005. When we look at the breakdown of the renewable energy types, we see that most increases show up with wind, and which is followed by solar and then digesters. Of course, there's a lot more solar, however, on the farm. And even though when we look at distributed generation, which we usually correspond to electricity, we're thinking most prominently of solar PV and wind. We have to take into account that on-farm energy is also produced with small hydro as electricity, geothermal and solar thermal, which can help with heating and cooling needs. Ethanol and diesel, which can be used on the farm as fuels or can be sold on the market, as well as biogas that is produced by methane digesters at livestock operations, and again can either be used on the farm or it can be sold or it can be distributed through the gas lines. Distributed generation is being installed because it comes with a number of benefits for the owners. First of all, it reduces energy expenditures. As we already noted, there is an ability to sell electricity back on the grid. Usually that comes in the form of reducing electricity bills, but there are cases where you actually have income generated from selling of energy back onto the system. And then, of course, the need to purchase electricity and other energy is going to be reduced if you can be producing it on the farm. The distributed renewable energy is also going to insulate the owners from price volatility and is going to provide reliable energy supply, especially in cases where there are no other options, as we have in off-grid and remote installations. The payback usually ranges from 6 to 30 years, and the return for renewable energy installation is going to depend on geographically variable energy prices, resource potential, and incentives. It's also, of course, going to depend on installation costs. What Denholm et al. Show in a study that they have in 2009 with NREL is that residential PV is going to be close to break-even costs in areas where we have high electricity prices and good solar resources like California, or high electricity prices and very good incentives like New York or Massachusetts. In terms of installation costs, we do know that these vary a lot geographically, and they're going to be a lot more expensive in areas that are rural or remote and where you don't have as much of a demand for these systems. However, what is most important about what is happening with distributed generation is the reduction in costs, and there was a mention earlier about the reduction in solar installation costs between 2009 and 2013. The per watt installation cost has been reduced by 50%. So in 2013, the cost was about $4 per watt installed, whereas in 2009 it was about $8 per watt. Of course, these installation costs are going to depend on the size of the system, and they're going to be a lot lower for larger sizes. However, in agriculture, we're going to have most systems be under 10 kilowatts or under 10 kilowatts. Another very important factor in the growth in renewable energy, of course, has been policy support, and especially the investment tax credit that was set at 30% since 2005. Farmers can also take advantage of Rural Energy for America program grants and loans that have been available since 2002, and the depreciation tax deduction since they are business entities, or when they are business entities. Net metering and interconnection, as we mentioned, has also been important, but it is good to note that not all net metering policies are effective, and only the effective ones have an impact. Same goes for the interconnection standards. The renewable portfolio standards are requirements for renewable electricity at the state level, and even though they're really directed to utility scale, they have had an impact in distributed generation as well, especially in the cases where we have a specific set aside for solar and distributed generation. There are other state financial incentives that also help reduce the cost of renewable energy installations, like tax credits, rebates, and production incentives that we're also going to be looking at. So what we find is that the determinants of adoption can be separated in farm characteristics, economic factors, state attributes, and then institutions and policies that affect renewable energy installations. And in terms of farm characteristics, we see a positive influence at the farm and at the state level, depending on the type of operation. For example, livestock operations have a positive impact. In terms of farm residents and land tenure, in terms of access to internet, and in terms of organic and conservation practices, income variables, and being newer farmers. In terms of economic factors, we see that solar resources and energy prices have a positive influence on adoption at the farm and state level. And for state attributes, per capita income levels for the state, democratic voting, and energy used in general in agriculture in that state has a positive impact as well. In terms of institutions and policies, best practices in both net metering and interconnection, not in each separately, both together, are going to positively influence adoption at the farm level. At the state level, we find that distributed generation, RPS, are going to have a positive influence in wind and solar adoption rates. And when it comes to wind adoption rates specifically, we also have a positive influence from new renewable RPS, which would mean wind, not something like hydro. In terms of cooperatives, we see that the share of customers that are served by electric cooperatives actually negatively influences adoption. The reason for this is that a lot of electric cooperatives, which historically have served rural areas and farm customers, are excluded from net metering, interconnection requirements, and RPSs. However, in the last years, more electric cooperatives are supporting renewable as an option for their business, and they have had some very interesting, there have been some very interesting examples, so it's going to be nice to see how this is going to evolve in the future. And then another thing that we see is that there are slight distinctions between the different types of renewable energy adoption. So in terms of wind, we see that the adoption of wind is going to be influenced not only from solar and distributed generation RPS, but also from new renewable RPS. Whereas where we look at solar adoption, we see that in addition to all the other variables, it is affected also by land tenure, the corresponding renewable energy resource, which is solar, and energy used. Whereas in terms of wind adoption, for example, we don't see that wind resource really affects adoption or energy used. In terms of other research, we are interested to figure out why we don't see a connection between financial policy instruments and adoption, especially because when we look at the average financial support received we see that it affects the size and the type that is chosen for the renewable energy system. So we do know that there is a relationship, but we don't see that it specifically impacts renewable energy adoption in the data that we have. It is possible that the decisions are instead determined by farmer characteristics. We see some evidence of that at the farm level research. And it is also possible that the instruments are not sufficiently large to induce significant impact. However, there is a caveat that possibly we just are not capturing the actual prices and incentives that farms are facing, and that the incentives that we have are not looking at the local level, and those might be more important at the end of the day in terms of financial policy instruments. And then last, in terms of REAP, we see that we don't have sufficient geographic distribution prior to 2009 to draw any conclusions whether they do affect adoption, which we haven't found. Because in the first 5 years of the REAP program, the grant awards tended to be concentrated in only a few states, whereas today each individual state rural development office has been allocated funds for its state, and thus it provides adequate variation in the award distribution so that we can evaluate this in the future.
Can I ask you a question about the REAP point at the bottom there?
Yeah.
So earlier this week, right, the department sent out about 1,100 new grants and loans. Will you be following up on that research to look at the geographic distribution? And
We could do that, yeah.
that'd be interesting to know.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, yeah. So in conclusion, we know that farms with distributed generation have increased fivefold in 5 years since 2007. And though the financial gain is a lot smaller, in distributed generation, when we compare it to wind leases, distributed generation does have a wider impact on farm and rural businesses. We also see that institutional and policy settings are important determinants for distributed generation. And this is important because Rural Development Utility Program is in a unique position to work with electric cooperatives to promote distributed generation of renewable energy. And we already know, like you said, that USDA's REAP has expanded access to rural businesses and farmers. In terms of future considerations, return for distributed generation will continue to depend on energy prices, resource potential, incentives, and installation costs. And while recent policy incentives have had a huge impact on adoption, and installation costs have decreased substantially and are projected to decrease even further, we don't know what's going to happen with electricity prices. It's going to depend on the interplay of shale gas innovations that are putting a downward pressure on prices, and greenhouse gas regulations, which of course are putting an upward pressure on gases. One other thing that I have not noted here is that as time passes, we see that the system sizes have been increasing, and that is going to change the distribution of the owners of distributed generation. And then lastly, what is quite important as well is the future of distributed generation by itself. 2014 was the first year where residential solar PV capacity surpassed commercial capacity. However, utility scale capacity is at the moment and seems to be leading growth in the future as well. Thank you very much.